Why has China been so quiet on this entire issue?
India was early to recognize the People's Republic of China. And so I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, why do we keep making this mistake?
Can we rely on America?
International relations is never about trust. Countries, they act when there's a convergence of interest, they act together. When there's not a convergence of interest, they don't act together. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, why after 75 years of trying have we been underperforming in our defense indigenization goals? And one of the things that came up from all of the participants, Russians, Americans, is there's still very little trust between Putin and Trump. What Putin wants is a demilitarized Ukraine. What Ukraine wants is a Ukraine that is capable of standing up to itself to prevent further adventurism on the...
What do you feel? How can Iran be contained from an American perspective? Because they have tried for decades.
Iran's influence to its west has really taken a beating. And I think that has led to a greater confidence on the part of Israel despite the difficulties in the Gaza war.
3 people are sitting, Trump, Zelensky and Putin, and saying that, okay, don't fight. Where is that meeting? Hello friends, I'm Gaurav Arya and you're watching GAP, the Gaurav Arya Podcast. Today we have with us Dhruva Jaishankar. He is Executive Director, ORF America. Welcome to our podcast, Dhruv.
Thank you for having me.
And it's such a pleasure. We've been trying for some time. Now finally we've got you. And so why ORF America? What does ORF America do?
Well, ORF is a think tank, a public policy think tank based in India. Offices in Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta. I joined ORF in 2019 to set up ORF America. This was the first time an Indian think tank was setting up outside of India, anywhere, including in the US. Now, one question I get is, what is a think tank? I put it very simply, we do 2 things. We do research on public policy issues that matter to governments and to public sector, and we make everything public. So if you want to know about why critical minerals matter, if you want to know how the US and India can cooperate on defense and security, we have work on all of this. So there's some areas we work on at ORF America, US-India relations, but also some broader issues related to Europe, Quad, Japan. We work on tech, we work on energy, we work on defense and security, and we work on economics and trade. So we have set up there. And part of it is, I think it was time to have an Indian perspective on some of these issues, global issues, and have it presented to a foreign audience. And that is really the purpose behind it. Since then, there's also been an ORF Middle East that has come up in Dubai. So I think we have started, hopefully, a trend of explaining India to the world.
Excellent. And you've written this book, Vishwa Shastra, India and the World. What is this book about? I've read excerpts. I've read parts of the book, not the whole book. Is this also a sort of an Indian outreach to the world to tell the world that this is India, this is how India works? Well,
this has only been published in India so far. I wrote it for an Indian audience mostly.
Okay.
And I tried to do 3 things with the book. One is tell a story of India's history of how India has interacted with the world from ancient times to the present day. So there are 5 chapters, about 200 pages. I've tried to keep it simple, written so that anybody can understand it, but telling the story of India and the world. How has India interacted with the world at different times? So I have 1 chapter before independence, 2 chapters on during the Cold War, first 15 years until 1971, and then 71 to 91. Then 2 chapters on what happened after 91. And it brings it all the way up to 2024. So the first thing is, I think in India, we need to understand where we have come from. And so I go into a lot of the issues of origins of our problems with China and Pakistan, so people understand that. What is India's sources of strategic thought and culture? I go into that as well. So those are some of the issues I cover. The second part of the book is looking at what is the strategy for India going forward. So I've outlined 5 big objectives for India and 14 main priority issues to work on. And finally, I've put 250 books at the end for people who are interested in other issues, what they should read, and how they can find out more about, say, India-China relations, India-US relations, defense and security, and things like that.
Excellent. Since you're, heading ORF America, I'd like to ask you, ever since Donald Trump has become president once more, Trump 2.0, on 20th of January this year, there have been a lot of changes in America. And we have discussed this in the previous podcasts also. What I'd like to specifically ask you is, number one, there seems to be now a series of U-turns, the latest of which is Trump said that I'm the only president who will not go to war. In fact, I'm the guy who will stop wars. Peace is what we seek. And then he goes and bombs the Houthis, which makes perfect military sense. So I'm not saying that it's a wrong thing or a right thing. I'm not going there. All I'm saying is that here is a guy who said that he will not start wars. Now, what they did was the Houthis, they fired a missile at Israel. They missed. It landed in Egypt. But the fact is that they'll try to get back at the Americans or the Israelis again.
Yes.
Is this not a new escalation that Trump has got into?
So I think Trump has been actually rather consistent on this point. He says, and he's said this for a long time, the US should not enter into open-ended conflict and should not give incentives for its allies. He believes that by the US providing support for Europe, that Europe is going to get into conflicts, is more likely to get into conflicts. So he says we're against open-ended conflicts. I want to bring an end to these kinds of conflicts. But he has been actually quite willing in his first term even to use force, sometimes quite dramatically, to send a message and instrumentally, So I'll give a few examples from his first term. He actually increased the tempo of US operations, of freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, in a bid to show China that we're not willing to accept your claims. He actually authorized the export of lethal weapons to Ukraine at a time when the US was hesitant to do that. We forget now he actually supported Ukraine at that time. He dropped the largest non-nuclear bomb in history in Afghanistan against ISIS Khorasan. So he was quite willing to use force instrumentally in certain conditions. What he's against is a sort of open-ended military intervention. So I think on this score, he's actually been, the less U-turns, he's been quite consistent on this.
So he does not want wars to go on and on. There should be, let's say, an intelligence or an information-based strike. Yes. You get rid of it, you wrap it up, and you come back.
General Soleimani,
Qasem Soleimani,
he targeted hit on him. Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, that's another example. He's willing to use force.
He's willing to use force. Okay. Now, another thing about these tariffs, and a lot of people are speaking about tariffs, and so I'm going to come to India next. First, I'd like to understand, China, and so, when he was taking over as president, he has been speaking about China. He's been speaking about tariffs on China, but not aggressively. So, in fact, there was a time when his public utterances almost made me believe that Donald Trump wants to be friends with China. I genuinely believe that he's sort of saying that, okay, let's not fight, and we can, because he said that, there are so many challenges and the US and China should partner and do this and that together. And he said it after taking over as president. But suddenly one day comes the whiplash and you have 20-25% tariffs on China. And China says, now, of course, most of the money that China is getting is through America or through Europe, outsourced, manufacturing in China that's happening. And suddenly what happens is that China says that the dragon and the elephant must do a ballet dance together. That's what the Chinese spokesperson said, Ministry of Foreign Affairs China. So I want your view on that. What suddenly happened? Why did he change track, or did he even change track? And now these things. And I'll also like to share with you the military perspective. I'm talking about India's military perspective because I keep on speaking to so many people. But first, the question to you, what happened?
So I think if you go to his first term, he started off by saying, let me meet with Xi Jinping. And he did. They met in Florida in Mar-a-Lago early in 2017 after he became president for the first time. At first, it seemed that this relationship would go well. That meeting seemed to have gone well. But in the months that followed, Trump got the impression that the Chinese were not living up to their end of the bargain. And so by about September, October of that year, suddenly the US under Trump took a much more tough line against China. And this played out in their national security strategy, which came out in December of 2017, which really signaled a shift in the US publicly saying we're in a competitive relationship with China and we're going to do something about it. And so the last 3 years of the Trump administration, and the pandemic actually added to this, was really marked by a much more hostile relationship between the US and China on trade. They closed consulates. They went after Huawei. It was a much more contested relationship, including support for Taiwan and other things. This largely continued under the Biden administration. Now, with Trump coming back, you are correct that there's been a change. It is unclear what one factor, if there even is one factor, has caused that. But at this point of time, he is getting multiple impulses from the people around him. There are those who are advocating for a more hawkish approach, particularly in the national security community. There are those who are saying, for economic reasons, we need to compete with China. And this includes a lot of his economic advisors. So if you look at the statements of his chief cabinet officials, they are quite consistent and quite tough on China. At the same time, though, there are those around him who are saying, we don't want an unnecessary escalation with China. We need to find a way to engage with them for political and security reasons. And finally, you have those who say, for economic reasons, we need to work with China. Now, right now, he's listening to all of them. Some days his views reflect those of one or particular advisor. I think it will still take a few months at least for this to play out. And some of this is going to be different factions around Trump playing out. But the fact is, despite him saying, he said this even when he was with Prime Minister Modi, standing next to him, that I know Xi Jinping, I want to engage with him, we need to talk about nuclear disarmament and other things together. Despite saying that, they have actually taken some quite strong steps on trade, on investment, to de-risk their economy further. And they understand that China is doing that too. So I think my sense is, overall, we're in for a more structural US-China competition. This does not mean that Trump will try to make some attempts at engagement, but so far there's been mixed messaging.
Yes. I just want to tell you also from the military perspective, what is happening is that, a lot of people, especially veterans and because they form a very influential group in India on the media, social media, and also they have this thing that, even our Prime Minister, he invited Xi Jinping to Ahmedabad and he first tried to reach out, and he tried peace. Even with Pakistan, he said, let's talk peace. When they did not listen, and when it went the other way, then you see a tougher Modi.
Yes, I have written about that both with China and with Pakistan and Prime Minister Modi's
So he went out of his way actually to, let's compromise, let's sit down, baat karte hain. They didn't listen. So then you see a different Modi now. My question is that they feel, or what I'm trying to say, rather, not a question, but what I'm trying to say is that a lot of people feel, even in the armed forces, that you can't trust China. And we must keep our powder dry. This sentence I've heard time and again at various informal meetings and, functions. And they would generally say, this is not to say that we will become aggressive, but we need to be fully prepared because China will come after us. This entire thing about the dance between the elephant and the dragon, it is temporary in nature because they see an outside threat from Trump. And therefore, button down the hatches and let's see so they've also said that if you want to fight trade, we'll fight trade. If you want to fight tariffs, we'll fight tariffs. And if there is something else, so this is a hint, something else, we'll fight till the very end. I just wanted your comments on that.
No, I think absolutely. I mean, I document this, India-China engagement from 1950 onwards. 1950 with the annexation of Tibet, China and India for the first time became direct neighbors. And I spent, I think, a good chunk of the book also talking about what happened between 1950 and 1962. Because there was this moment in 1954, there was a major summit. You had Panchsheel, this idea that India and China can get along. Bandung, there was cooperation. And yet we know there was Chinese road building in Aksai Chin that was happening from 1952 or so onwards. So even as China was talking to India at that time, in a supposedly friendly way, and actually taking advantage in some ways of India's willingness to welcome it into the international community. India was early to recognize the People's Republic of China. At the same time, China was doing all these things to undermine Indian interests on the border and subsequently in other areas. 1976, we had the restoration of top-level diplomatic ties around that time between India and China. At the same time, in 1976, China entered into an agreement with Pakistan to provide nuclear technology. So again, we have a history of this. This history repeats itself periodically. Again, 2009 onwards, there was cooperation on BRICS between India and China. Yet at the same time, we had those incidents of stapled visas for people from Arunachal Pradesh. We had a cutting off of contacts with the Northern Command. So even in these good times, we've had this. And so I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, why do we keep making this mistake? Again, right now there's been a bit of a thaw in relations between India and China on the border. Why are we hearing voices now that say, Acha, everything is over, we need to get back to normal relations with China, when we know that there's a possibility that any kind of interdependence could and possibly will be weaponized in the future?
Absolutely. Now, one thing that I wanted to ask you, and this is from America's foreign policy perspective. They have very powerful institutions, but one of the things about institutions is a sense of continuity. That is what institutions also give you. So, Dhruv, here's the question. You see, Israel and America are like absolute buddies. I mean, they've been supporting each other like what? Suddenly, Joe Biden says that 2,000-pound bombs I'm not sending to Israel because there is too much of pressure. And at that particular moment, when it is required, they stop shipment at the harbor. They stop it. The ships will not go to Israel. That is one. Trump comes. He says, send the bombs. Send larger bombs. You see, now this puzzles a guy like me who's been a soldier. Can we rely on America? And the reason why I ask this is that Donald Trump says buy defense equipment from us, buy F-15 Eagles. But maybe there is a deal for an F-35 in the horizon somewhere in the future. Buy strikers, buy javelins. I mean, tomorrow we could be in a war and America switches off the tap.
Right. So the Israel thing, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, I think talking to Israelis, they were actually quite surprised by how much the Biden administration provided them, despite a lot of criticism from the Democratic Party, his own party. So I think they actually saw Biden leaning quite forward in most defense articles. They prioritized things over Taiwan and in some cases even Ukraine in providing arms shipments to Israel. Again, despite a lot of political, a lot of people on the left in the US being quite upset by that. And Trump also has actually been quite restraining in certain ways with Israel. He, in fact, in some ways pushed them towards a ceasefire in a way that Biden could not do. But getting to your larger question, look, what I try and argue is, look, international relations is never about trust. What countries, they act when there's a convergence of interest, they act together. When there's not a convergence of interest, they don't act together. And Trump is just saying that very openly, not just with India, but he's saying that with Europe as well, right? Where our interests align, we'll work together. But if you're doing something and I feel my interests are not being supported, I'm not going to help you. So this is, I think, a reality. I mean, what I try and show is this is a reality throughout time. This is one of the fundamental tenets of international relations. This is the basis of it. So, but getting back to the question on should you buy arms from whom? Right? Every leadership in India has said we want to focus on defense indigenization, but our record isn't very good. And I think the real test is we're still very dependent on imports. Perhaps after some of the Middle Eastern countries and Ukraine and countries at war, India has some of the largest defense imports in the world.
Yes.
75 years almost after more than 75 years after independence, our exports have grown in the last 3 to 5 years. It's actually been quite, I think, surprisingly good. Yet until recently were very meager. Our defense imports were not competing in the global marketplace, which is a sign of quality. It's a sign of, so we were underperforming. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves is why, after 75 years of trying, have we been underperforming in our defense indigenization goals? I think the answer, I imply what some of the answers are. There are many reasons why we've not done that. We got used to cheap license production. There are many reasons for it. We didn't have the Forex reserves in the past. We weren't able to buy at scale. We were buying one squadron at a time rather than buying 15 squadrons that would make the unit costs come down. There were many reasons for it. But I think we're now at a stage where we can rectify this. But one way of accelerating that is to do it in a way that really facilitates and incentivizes technology transfers. And if we can do that, then we will build that indigenization over time. So there's with the US, for example, there's certain things that they provide that are top of the line that our armed services feel they should have. we need P-8s because they're the only planes that fly at, given the range, that they have the capabilities, all of that, right? So, we need 3, 5. If the unit numbers are small, it makes sense to buy off the shelf. But there are other things where that does not make sense. And I think this is where we have had some tough bargaining, which is if we're going to buy 200 of this platform, then some of that needs to be manufactured or assembled in India. And this is the only way we can over time build up a defense ecosystem that ultimately a self-reliant India will need. Now, again, there are many lessons learned why we haven't done in the past, and many things we need to do still. But this is part of that process. So I don't think it comes down to trust. I think having the strategy is, I believe, one of indigenization on the one hand and diversification on the other. Having multiple suppliers for multiple units, and this is what over time this will help build up that indigenous defense base. That I think is a longer-term objective.
All right, I'm going to still ask you questions on America's foreign policy because ORF America. So tell me this now. President Trump has spoken to Putin. They got off very well on a 2-hour phone call. That is what the media tells us. The details are still trickling in, but Zelensky has been left out of this. Now, earlier what used to happen was that Zelensky would have these peace conferences on Ukraine in Switzerland where 100 countries would go, sponsored, of course, by the West, and they would go there and Zelensky would be this big hero wearing camouflage and etc. Now, suddenly, Trump is talking to Russia and Zelensky is out. Zelensky got a dressing down in the Oval Office. My question to you specifically is, earlier, when Russia was excluded, it was wrong because Russia needs to be on the table. If two guys are fighting, you have to talk to both of them. Today, Ukraine is being excluded. I mean, where is that meeting? My question is, where is that meeting where 3 people are sitting, Trump, Zelensky and Putin, and saying that, okay, don't fight? Where is that meeting?
That may or may not happen at some point of time. I think it's complicated because, essentially, Ukraine has certain red lines. Russia has certain red lines, and there's currently no overlap. And that is why the fighting continues. It's very easy for the US in some ways to say they should not be fighting, and we will not, Trump is trying to use leverage with both Russia and Ukraine to bring about an end to that fighting. But yesterday at the Raisina Dialogue, I was moderating a discussion with 2 Russians and 3 Americans, and this was the subject of our discussion. And one of the things that came up from all of the participants, Russians, Americans, is there's still very little trust between Putin and Trump. That Trump, despite Trump's best efforts, there's not sufficient trust on the Russian side that they can follow. I think something else will happen. Whatever the US does, the message that is going to the other Europeans is that we need to step up. And that's happening. I think we may even be underestimating the degree to which some European countries are going to step up in some way. This includes possibly UK, France, Germany, the Nordics, Baltics, Poland, Czech Republic, maybe a few others. And this includes the 2 aspects to it. One is, can they build up rapidly the defense industrial base to provide some of the arms to Ukraine and to others that provides even a partial substitute for the US. If you look at the spending just that Germany is doing, they will have the financial resources to do that. Again, there's still some ifs and buts on whether they can do it in a timely manner. The second bigger challenge in some ways is what their operational prospects are. Do they do it under a NATO flag? It's very difficult if the US is not part of that. Do they create some other coalition? And what are the terms? I mean, essentially what the fighting is about right now is what are the terms for Ukraine after the ceasefire happens. It's not about territory anymore. The territory will change very little. It is really what are the terms of Ukraine. What Putin wants is a demilitarized Ukraine. What Ukraine wants is a Ukraine that is capable of standing up to itself to prevent further adventurism on the part of Russia.
If not a NATOized Ukraine.
I think a NATOized Ukraine is very unlikely because the US is not interested in that. And by the way, there are other NATO countries, Hungary and others, Turkey possibly, who would not allow Ukraine to, they require consensus of all all the countries, and that's very unlikely. But short of that, there are other possibilities. So that is really what the terms of that engagement are. And I would say there are 4 key stakeholders there, which is the US, Russia, Ukraine, and actually the other Europeans as well. So some coalition of European countries. So again, we're going to be in this zone where whatever the US does, we are in for a Europe-Russia contest. And that is going to play out in Ukraine either through military means or indirect military means, or even if there is, and we all hope there is a ceasefire, I think, even if there's a ceasefire through non-military means. And this is going to continue.
Let's go to the other war that's happening in West Asia. 2 days back, they started this bombing, and I believe more than 450 odd Palestinians have been killed.
Gaza,
and Netanyahu says this is just the beginning. He started off again. Hamas says that he does not want to get the hostages back. Now, that is one part of the story that is playing out. My question to you is a little different. I agree, for one, that Iran is sponsoring all this. And, there's a lovely article in that magazine also, called Proxies and Levers, written by Lieutenant General Saeed Atta Hasnain. He commanded the Srinagar Corps. General Hasnain. It's a wonderful, wonderful article. And he writes about proxies and levers. There are many in the national security establishment of the United States of America who feel that, the way to do it, the way to end strife in this region is somehow get Iran to agree not to do it. So I'm not saying regime change, because those are not their words. What do you feel? How can Iran be contained from an American perspective? Because they have tried for decades. They're not able to handle Iran, because just now when Trump said that, I'm going to do this and that, he says, do whatever you wish, I don't care.
So West Asia is very complicated, as you know.
Yes.
I put it very simply. Part of the reason it's complicated is you have at least 6 quite significant powers in the region who are jostling for influence. You have Saudi Arabia, the UAE, who are on many issues aligned, although there are some differences between them on certain issues, including in Sudan. You have Israel. You have Qatar, which has sometimes been competing with the UAE and others in different ways. You have Iran. And then you have Turkey. And all are quite autonomous. All are jostling for influence in this region. The trend we had seen over time was a kind of de facto coalition between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel that was coming together.
Yes.
This has been complicated. One of their shared concerns, by the way, was Iran. Now, this is further complicated by another layer, which is all the major powers in the world also have a stake in the West Asia. US does, Russia does, China does, India does, Europe does. So that has complicated the picture a fair amount. So this is, I think, the dynamic that has taken. Now, what has happened we were entering an area where we were seeing this coming together of UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel. We were really on the brink of a Saudi Arabia-Israel normalization when October 7th, 2023 happened. The attack by Hamas against Israel and the war in Gaza that followed. Initially, that war was not going so well from Israel's point of view. It was very costly. They were getting... But they've done a few developments have happened since then. They've taken the fight to Hezbollah in a very dramatic fashion that has really decimated Hezbollah for a long time. This seems to have been a conflict they were preparing for from 2006 onwards. Another development is the fall of the Assad government in Syria.
Yes.
And so a combination of these factors, coupled with some strikes against the Houthis, really means that Iran's influence to its west has really taken a beating. And I think that has led to a greater confidence on the part of Israel, despite the difficulties in the Gaza war that have... So this is, I think, where we are at right now. A number of things could happen. You have Iran joining BRICS on the one hand. You have President Trump actually signaling possibility of some outreach to Tehran, despite saying that they want to denuclearize Iran. You have Israel now putting more pressure via Lebanon and Syria against Iran. So I think the picture has become a bit more, from Iran's point of view, not as not as positive as it looked even 2 years ago. And that's going to lead to some very interesting choices that all of these actors will have to play. Now, again, I would look at a few things just going forward. One is how quickly can we get back to a ceasefire and some kind of settlement of some kind, even a tentative one in Gaza, because that will again open up room for Israel-Saudi normalization. Related to that, how can India take advantage of that to connect all UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and onto the Mediterranean through what is called IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. Another factor is how will this US-Iran dynamic play out if Iran feels it's on the back foot? This is going to be a challenge because for the government there to do that kind of outreach with the US would be very difficult at home. And there's another factor to take into account, which is the Ayatollah Khamenei. He's getting on in age.
Yes.
And there are questions about succession there. So all of this presents a very intricate and difficult picture where small changes, many of which have been unexpected or are unexpected nature, can really tilt the balance in different ways. But I do think this is all very worth, from India's point of view, given India's incredible stakes in West Asia, to monitor and follow this very carefully.
You mentioned BRICS, so I'll just ask you this question and then I'll move on to my last. China has been unusually quiet in this entire piece, where the Russians were out. They were out of Syria because they were pushed out of Syria. The Iranians were out of Syria. And of course, China has very real stakes. They have MOUs worth $400 billion. How many will fructify? Time will tell. But yes, they have a very real interest. The China-Pakistan economic corridor is very, very close by. In fact, it touches Iran. Why has China been so quiet on this entire issue?
So China's economic stakes in West Asia are quite significant. They've had relations in the Gulf with Iran, with Israel, with many others, and continue to do so. They have taken, a few things. They have taken a particularly strident position against Israel after the Gaza war, which has been noted in Israel. So this idea that they could work more with China has taken a bit of a hit. They were at one time entertaining the idea of China investing more in some of their critical infrastructure. The security relationship between China and Iran has deepened. And this is now moving into more technological realms, including drones and unmanned systems. Recently, there was also a China, Russia, Iran trilateral military naval exercise that was held off the Iranian coast. So again, broadly, and I'd say one other factor, which is China's actually, the PLA Ocean is actually quite active in West Asia, west of India more than east of India in some ways. There are at least 6 ports that the PLA Navy uses for regular refueling and replenishment. Yes. So, but broadly, I think, China has been very careful about trying not to get its hands burnt on from a security standpoint, beyond some of the Indian Ocean the Indian Ocean role, to sort of stay above the fray. That being said, obviously their economic interests are there, continue to be there, and continue to deepen with almost all of the key stakeholders in the Gulf. So I think that partly explains why the relative silence. They feel this is an area where it's already quite crowded because of these quite potent middle powers, and also the US, Russia, France, others playing a very much more active military role in the region. So that, I think, largely explains that combination of hesitation of not overreaching on the security side, but also very diversified and very deep economic stakes explains why China's relative silence.
And with that, I come to my last question, and we can't have a podcast without mentioning Pakistan here, because that is what has been sort of intriguing me for the past couple of weeks now, ever since the Jafar Express attack took place. And of course, Pakistan, as usual, says India is behind it. And we responded saying that, we don't take them very seriously anyway. So the question is, how's this playing out in the sense that America gives about $400 million to Pakistan for the F-16s, right? You get your spare parts, you get your ammunition, you get your software updated, whatever you wish. Maintenance, essentially. Apart from that, Pakistan, we'll all agree, is geostrategically extremely important, because that is how the country is, though India has, to a very large extent, circumvented it. My question is, if there is a Trump outreach to Tehran, right? Now they have the Chabahar port, which is India managed and built, and not very far from Chabahar you have the Gwadar port, which is China managed and built. Now, my question is slightly long, and the question is that, if you look at the map, you'll see that the reason why Pakistan has been important to America is that, because America never got along well with Iran. So, ever since 79, there have been sanctions, etc. Pakistan, it's like you tick off the menu what you want, you pay money and you get it done. That is how Pakistan works. So you have stuff landing in Bin Qasim port in Karachi. It goes all the way to Torkham. It goes into Afghanistan. That is how the Americans fought for 20 years. Yes. And even before that, during 79, 89, when the Soviets were there, this is what the Americans were doing through this route. My question is, let us say India or Indian diplomacy plays a stellar role in saying that let us try and mainstream Iran. This is hypothetical. And America says, okay. You mentioned an outreach. Therefore, my question comes from that word outreach. Normalize it. Maybe the Ayatollah Khamenei will not be around after 3-4 years. So, speak to the next leadership. Does this help us absolutely circumvent Pakistan?
I think there are two different parts of it. I don't think the Iran-Pakistan dynamic is not Iran for Pakistan. I think that I would treat them very separately. First of all, Iran has done very little for India. We have Chabahar, we have North-South Transportation Corridor, we have some cooperation in Afghanistan, but this is no longer. India's stakes are otherwise quite modest in Iran. If there's any outreach that's going to happen from the US, it's not going to be because of India. Iran has certainly not helped India when India has needed that kind of help.
On the contrary,
sometimes. Yes. I would put Iran in a separate basket. I think that, again, I've talked about what some of the dynamics at play are. Pakistan's a different issue. I think for many years, Pakistan made itself useful, first against China in the 1960s for the US, then against the Soviet Union in support of the Mujahideen against the Red Army in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and then after September 11th, whereas the US was at war in Afghanistan, Pakistan was needed for a number of things, including some intelligence cooperation, which they would provide just enough to keep it going, for lines of communication, as you mentioned, and for other reasons, by airspace they provided as well. Now, I think we underestimate how tired and fed up the US is with Pakistan, because they knew the whole time that Pakistan was playing a double game, and this really manifested itself with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was a bit of a disaster. Pakistan's role was quite clear. So today, US military assistance is now to Pakistan is very low. There's some residual F-16 and a few other platforms, but it's quite low. In fact, in terms of value, in some cases, Russia provides more to Pakistan than the US does, mostly because of the engines that they use on Chinese-built fighters. So I think that is changing. Now, obviously, Pakistan's going to try to make itself useful in some ways. We saw just a month or two ago at the State of the Union address by Donald Trump, he thanked Pakistan for apprehending ISIS
the terrorist
who was responsible for the Abbey Gate bombing. So they'll find their ways to make useful, but I don't think it's going to go back to a US role in Afghanistan type situation, and I think that's quite readily apparent. So I think for India, I think this is an India-Pakistan issue. Pakistan is currently beset by three major crises: a political crisis, because between Imran Khan supporters and everybody else.
Yes.
An economic crisis, which China is actually not willing to bail them out of, and so they're struggling there.
Yes.
And a security crisis, not on the eastern frontier,
the
with
traditional
India,
eastern,
but the western frontier.
But the western front, yes.
And these are three crises that are of Pakistan's making. So as long as Pakistan is in this situation, I think India will continue to do what it is, which is reach out and cooperate with all the other stakeholders to the extent possible, make Pakistan gradually more and more irrelevant, and basically put the onus on Pakistan for saying, if you want to get yourself out of these troubles, you have to clean up your act, including on terrorism, and then we can see where we go from there. So I think this question of sort of making Pakistan using positive and negative levers, sticks and carrots, to get Pakistan to change its behavior is what it's all about. And the more that India can isolate Pakistan, the easier it gets.
The better it is, and the easier.
The more leverage India has.
The more leverage India has. Thank you very much for talking to us, Dhruv. And ladies and gentlemen, we have this book. It's Vishwa Shastra, and this is written by Dhruva Jaishankar. The link is in the comments section below. It's pinned. Go to Amazon, click on this link, buy this book. I also have read only parts of this book. I promise to read the entire book shortly. And I will take back an author's autographed copy with me. This one I got, but I'm going to take this back, duly autographed by him. Thank you very much for joining. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll meet you again next week with another very special guest. Till then, take care and Jai Hind.